Level 1. The unknown. Nobody's looking for you yet. Not really. You robbed a pharmacy, alone on a Tuesday night, 20 minutes before closing. Ski mask over your face, low voice, canvas bag flat on the counter. The pharmacist gave you what he had in the drawer, $420 and a box of OxyContin you hadn't asked for. You walked out the back door. You walked 6 blocks to your car. You drove home. You ate cold leftovers standing in front of your fridge. The next morning, local police open a file. A detective glances at it between two more pressing cases. The security camera captured a silhouette in black under orange light. Nothing identifiable. The file lands in a pile. You're not a priority yet. You're a statistic. Armed pharmacy robberies happen dozens of times every week in this country. Most of them are never solved. Resources are limited. Detective attention too. As long as you stay quiet, as long as you don't spend the money all at once, as long as you don't talk to anyone, you're invisible. The mistake most people make at this stage is believing that invisibility is a permanent condition, that if they made it through the first few weeks without being identified, they won. They didn't win. They just bought time. And time gets counted. Level 2. The pattern. 3 months later, you do it again. Another pharmacy, different city, 60 miles out. Same method, same hour, same canvas bag, $680 this time, and you walk out clean. Then a third, a fourth. You have a logic. Different cities, different counties, never the same state twice in less than 6 weeks. You think the fragmentation protects you. It betrays you because different investigators in different jurisdictions start comparing notes, not out of genius, out of routine. There's a federal database for that. The FinCEN, the NIBRS. Systems you didn't know existed. That aggregate, compare, filter. A crime analyst in a shoebox office somewhere in a city you've never visited notices something. The timing, the target profile, the behavior during the robberies. Calm, methodical, no shouting, no violence. A professional or someone who thinks they're a professional, which amounts to the same thing on a spreadsheet. He creates a file. He gives it a provisional code name, a series designation. Not you yet. Just a behavior, a ghost in the data, but a ghost with a signature. And signatures get analyzed. Level 3. The face. You make a mistake that looks like a precaution. You switch from pharmacies to jewelry stores. The margins are better. The risks seem similar. You spend a month casing targets, noting employee schedules, camera angles, local police response times. You're meticulous. You think you're invisible. The second jewelry store has a facial recognition system the owner installed himself after a break-in the year before. He didn't notify his insurer. He didn't post a notice in the window either. You didn't know. You couldn't have known. The camera captures your eyes the moment you cross the threshold, just before you pull your mask down. A fraction of a second. An angle you hadn't accounted for. The image is blurry but usable. The owner hands it to local police. Local police forward it to the regional FBI field office. A technician runs it through NEC NeoFace, facial recognition software that matches features against millions of ID photos, criminal records, driver's licenses. No perfect match, but partial matches. A list of 23 names. Your name is 14th on that list. An agent starts investigating the 14th name. He pulls your history. He talks to people who knew you. He asks questions nobody seems to know how to answer, and that's exactly what confirms he's asking the right ones. Your face starts circulating. Not in the media yet. Not on posters yet, but in the right hallways. Between the right people, your face now exists in a file that carries your name. Level 4. The hunt. They know who you are. They have your address, the one from 2 years ago, no longer valid. Your social security number, the make and plate of a car you sold for cash 6 months back. Your ex-girlfriend you haven't seen in 18 months. They have everything else too. Your phone, the old one, the one you thought you'd wiped clean before selling it on Craigslist. The buyer reset it, but phone data doesn't erase like that. It overwrites, gradually. FBI technicians work from layers you thought were gone. Cell tower records cover the 90 days before the sale. They map your movements, your habits, your geographic comfort zones, the city you drive to on Tuesday nights, the highway exit you take every single time. They're building something that looks like a map of your life. You, meanwhile, think you're being smart. You use prepaid phones bought in cash at gas stations. You pay motels in cash. You eat at places without cameras. You swap cars every 2 months. Vehicles bought off classified sites, never registered in your name. All of that slows the hunt down. None of it stops it. Because the hunt isn't linear. It's tentacular. It moves on 20 fronts simultaneously, and it only takes one to land. An old coworker, someone you hadn't spoken to in 3 years, gets a visit from an agent. The agent shows him your photo. He says he doesn't know anything. That's true, but on his way out, the agent leaves a card. And the coworker, that evening, mentions it to his wife. And the wife remembers something you said once at a backyard barbecue. That if you ever had to disappear somewhere, it'd be up in the northwest corner of New Mexico. Because you grew up near there and you knew the roads. She calls the number on the card. It isn't much. It's a vague memory of a sentence spoken in passing at a barbecue 4 years ago. But it's enough to redirect an investigation. And redirected investigations close. Level 5, The Fugitive. You're in a motel room in Gallup, New Mexico. Queen bed, brown carpet, window AC unit that sounds like a bad engine. You're eating chips and watching local news on a flat screen with a cracked corner. You don't know yet that they know where you are. Not exactly, but they know the zone. They have a 50-mile radius around Gallup where their data converges. They're just waiting for you to move because you're going to move. Fugitives always move. The next morning, you check out at 6. Full tank of gas and a plan to push into Arizona. You take Highway 40 west, window cracked, coffee in the cup holder. The roadblock appears 20 kilometers from the state line. You spot it early enough to exit at the previous ramp. You drive secondary roads, red and dusty, through a landscape of mesas and dry brush. Your heart is beating too hard. You're breathing through your mouth. They've been tracking your car for an hour via a surveillance device an agent placed in the motel parking lot while you slept. A magnetic transmitter stuck under the frame. Invisible. Silent. They don't need a roadblock. They know exactly where you're going. You pull over at a deserted truck stop to check a paper map you bought at a gas station 3 weeks ago. You get out of the car. The air is dry and cold and smells like red dirt. You see the dust before you see the vehicles. 3 black SUVs. A helicopter you hear before you see it clear a ridgeline. You run into the desert. It's a reflex, not a plan. There's nowhere to go in the New Mexico desert. The terrain is flat and open. They see you better than you see them. You last 3 minutes. Then your knees give out in the loose dirt. You go down. You stay there, face against the red ground, arms out, lungs burning. Someone puts a knee in your back. You hear the metal of handcuffs. You hear voices coordinating over radio. The helicopter circles above you in slow loops. You don't move. There's nothing left to do but stop moving. What follows unfolds in an order they presented to you as procedure, but which felt more like a slow erasure. The interrogation room. The court-appointed attorney who has 15 minutes to talk to you before the preliminary hearing. The judge who reads the charges in a civil servant's voice that has read thousands of charges before yours and will read thousands more after. Aggravated armed robbery, 7 counts, attempted flight, illegal weapons possession. The federal prosecutor offers a deal. Plead guilty on 5 counts, 22 years. You say yes. The sentencing hearing lasts 17 minutes. The judge asks if you understand the sentence. You say yes. He says 22 years, no possibility of early parole before 2/3 served. He bangs his gavel. He moves to the next file. They take you away. FCI Tucson, medium security facility. Sand-colored concrete walls, double rows of concertina wire fencing that catches the Arizona sun like something decorative. Your cell is 75 square feet. A metal bunk bolted to the wall, a sink, a lidless toilet, a window the size of an encyclopedia that looks out onto an interior yard where 3 men have been walking in circles since before sunrise. Your cellmate's name is Marcus. He's been inside 11 years. He doesn't ask what you did. He walks you through the unwritten rules with the efficiency of someone who's had this conversation too many times. Rule 1 is don't owe favors. Rule 2 is don't be curious. Rule 3 is that respect is earned by being consistent, not by being tough. You listen. The months pass with a slowness that has no equivalent in ordinary life. Time in prison isn't linear. It isn't a line moving forward. It's a series of identical boxes you check off one by one, and the unchecked stack in front of you stays so high for so long that at some point you stop looking at it. You work in the furniture fabrication shop. 8 hours a day, 6 days a week. You read in the library at night. You call your mother on Sundays. 10 regulation minutes. She's aging faster than she should be. You can hear it in her voice. Worry wears people down. By year 5, you no longer think of the outside as a real place. It's an abstraction, a direction you look in sometimes without really believing in it. By year 10, you don't look in that direction anymore. The years pass. Your mother dies in the winter of your 13th year inside. You find out through a call the on-duty guard lets you make on a Wednesday at 2 in the afternoon. You go back to your cell. You sit on your bunk. You stare at the concrete wall for what feels like a long time. Marcus says nothing. He knows when to be quiet. The next morning, you go to the shop. You work 8 hours. You go back. You eat. You sleep. That's all there is to do. You get out on a Tuesday in November, 19 years after sentencing. Early release for good behavior. 2.5 years less than expected. You're 51 years old. You weigh 20 pounds less than when you went in. You have chronic lower back pain. Your hair is completely white. They hand you a brown paper envelope. It holds your personal effects: an empty wallet, keys to a car that no longer exists, a watch with a cracked crystal. They hand you a second envelope with $380 in worn bills. That's it. A van drops you at the Tucson bus station. You have a ticket to Phoenix and the address of a halfway house you've never seen. You wait inside the terminal. Around you, people are staring at screens: phones, tablets, information displays. The world has interfaces you don't recognize. The cars outside have shapes you've never seen. The music coming from the overhead speakers sounds like something, but not anything you can name. You feel like you've arrived from another country, one that speaks the same language but where every cultural code was changed while you were gone. You find an ATM. You feed the bills in one at a time. You buy a coffee in a cardboard cup with a lid that snaps on in a way you have to look at for 3 full seconds before you understand it. You sit down on an orange plastic bench. You wait for the bus. Outside, the November sun is white and heatless. The mountains in the distance are purple. A pigeon walks in circles in front of the automatic doors. You drink your coffee. 19 years ago, you were trying to disappear. You almost made it. Not the way you imagined. Not into the open desert freedom you had in your head, but gone all the same. Erased from the world, filed into a box, counted twice a day until the count came up right. The bus arrives, you get on. You find a window seat and press your forehead against the cold glass. The city moves past, signs you don't recognize. Buildings you didn't see go up. The world kept going without you. It's still going now, and you're starting over.